What if there's something in the deep woods that isn't just legend, something that watches, something that remembers? Here's what happened to a man who found out. The cold had a voice that winter. Not just the sound of wind through timber, but something underneath it, a low moan that seemed to thread through the very bones of the mountain itself. Thomas Weatherby had lived in the Cascades long enough to know the difference between wind and intention, between weather and presence. At 73, he'd learned to listen to what the forest was actually saying, rather than what his fear wanted to hear. But this was different. The cabin sat 6 miles from the nearest road, a 2-hour drive from the town of Alpine, Washington, and a lifetime away from anything that resembled civilization. Thomas had built it himself 34 years ago with his own hands, back when those hands were younger, and his reasons for leaving the world behind made sense even to him. The logs had weathered to the color of old bone. The roof leaked in 3 places when the snow came heavy. The porch sagged at the corners like an old man's knees. It was perfect. He'd come here after the fire. That's how he marked time now, before the fire and after. Before, when Margaret was alive, and the house in Tacoma still stood, and his daughter Emma could walk without the oxygen tank. After, when the world had burned, and he had no reason to stay in cities where people moved too fast and didn't know how to sit with their own grief. The fire had taken the house first. July, and hot enough that the temperature climbed past 90 degrees. He'd been at work 30 years as a commercial electrician. All those skills suddenly useless when there was nothing left to wire. Margaret had been inside. Emma, visiting from California, had been in the guest room. The fire department said they went fast. That was supposed to be a comfort. He'd taken the insurance money and disappeared into the mountains. That was a long time ago. Long enough that the sharp edges of grief had worn smooth like river stones. Long enough that he could think of Margaret without his chest seizing up. Long enough that he'd built a life here, quiet, solitary, purposeful in its emptiness. The cabin kept him occupied. The woods kept him occupied. The seasons kept him occupied. Winter especially. Winter required attention. Thomas sat in the chair by the hearth, the same chair he'd carved from oak and finished himself, back when he still believed that creating beautiful things might somehow balance the ledger. A cup of black coffee sat cooling in his hands. The fire was low, just enough heat to keep the main room from freezing, just enough light to push back the darkness, creeping in through the windows as the afternoon collapsed into evening. Outside, snow had been falling for 3 days straight. Not the wet, heavy snow of early winter, but the fine, determined kind that came in late February. The kind that meant business. The kind that could bury a man if he wasn't careful. The wind was picking it up off the ground and throwing it around like it had a purpose, like it was searching for a way in. The shutters trembled against their latches. Thomas heard it clearly, not in his ears, so much as in his bones. That metallic rattle, twice, then a scraping sound as wind tore at the corner post where the wood had started to rot. He'd been meaning to replace it. He'd been meaning to do a lot of things. Time had a way of shifting those intentions aside. He didn't move right away. Movement meant accepting that something needed doing. At his age, with winter deep in the mountains, acceptance felt like surrender. The sound came again, louder this time, not the wind. Thomas set the coffee cup down on the rough table beside his chair, a table he'd made from a single slab of cedar that had taken him 2 years to plane and finish properly. He pushed himself up, the way older men do, using the arms of the chair for leverage, joints making small complaints like old machinery too long in disuse. The window above the door was thick with frost. He used the heel of his hand to clear a small circle, enough to see out into the white chaos. The snow fell thick as smoke, visibility maybe 20 feet, before the trees became ghosts and the ghosts became nothing at all. That's when he saw it. At first, just a smear on the glass, something that had pressed against the frozen pane from outside. He blinked, thinking it was his eyes playing tricks, the way they did sometimes when the light was wrong. But it was real, a mark, something damp and dark, pressed against the window with considerable pressure. No hand he knew could make that mark. Thomas stepped back from the window and stood very still. The fire cracked behind him. The wind tried again at the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a tree groaned under the weight of accumulated snow that sounded like timber bending just before it breaks. He went to the door. Moved slow, the way you move when you're not certain what you're walking toward. His hand found the latch iron, cold, familiar from 10,000 previous openings. He didn't unlock it, just stood there for a moment, listening. The wind howled, the snow hissed against the wood, and underneath, almost inaudible, something that might have been breathing. Thomas pulled the door open. The wind hit him like a fist, snow immediately filling the doorway, the cold so sharp it caught in his throat like a hook. For a moment, he couldn't see anything. Just white, just cold, just the chaos of weather that had no mercy for old men standing in open doorways. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw the shape. It was collapsed on the porch, its massive bulk partially covered already by the snow that had drifted there. Enormous, nothing human. The fur was matted dark, stained darker still with blood that was already beginning to freeze in the intense cold. One massive arm lay across the boards of the porch, claws like curved daggers extending from fingers as thick as branches. Behind it, huddled close and shaking, were two smaller figures. Thomas didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't think, because thinking would have meant processing information that contradicted everything he believed about the world. The big one, the mother, he understood that immediately with a knowledge that came from somewhere older than logic, didn't lift her head. Her breathing was heavy, labored, each inhale a sound like wind through a cave. The smaller ones, her young, stayed close to her, their own breath creating small clouds of steam in the brutal cold. They didn't growl, they didn't attack, they didn't make any sound except the sound of survival breath, pulled in harsh and careful, held, released. Their eyes found him. Not with aggression, with a kind of pleading that went deeper than species, that went down to something bone deep about being alive in a world that was trying to kill you. Thomas stepped back without thinking. His body had decided for him. He cleared the doorway, pulling the door open wider, leaving space. An invitation offered without words, without conscious choice. Just the old reflex of humanity meeting something broken and choosing not to break it further. It took a long time for them to move. The smaller of the two young ones was first, tiny compared to the mother but still massive, still other, still everything that shouldn't exist, walking toward his cabin on frozen paws. It crept forward slowly, testing, ready to bolt. The other one followed, the bigger of the two, and together they leaned under the mother's massive form and began to drag her toward the open door. Thomas backed further into the cabin. His legs felt strange, disconnected from his brain. He found himself moving without deciding to move, clearing space, pulling aside the stack of firewood he kept by the entry, using his foot to sweep the floor clean of debris. He set the lantern down on the table. Then he stepped back and waited. It was an awkward, painful process. The mother's injuries made every movement a negotiation with pain, but slowly, carefully, the two younger ones dragged her across the threshold and into the warmth of the cabin. Once inside, they seemed to understand that they could release her. They lowered her gently to the cleared space by the hearth, the younger one making a sound from deep in its throat, a hum, almost musical, almost gentle. The mother's eye cracked open slowly, tracking Thomas, but there was no threat in it, just exhaustion, just the simple need to survive the night. Thomas turned away and walked to the stove. If he thought about what was happening, he would have to confront the impossibility of it. Better to move. Better to do what hands knew how to do. The kettle was cold. He filled it with snow from the bucket he kept by the door, set it on the stove. The fire in the hearth needed feeding. He added a log, and then another, careful to build the heat steady without overwhelming it. The cabin had been maintained by a single man for a long time. It understood efficiency. While the water heated, he gathered what he had. Blankets, not the ones Margaret had picked out years ago, those he'd kept wrapped in a cedar chest in the back room, but old ones, army surplus, rough as burlap. He laid these near the fire, several layers, creating a kind of nest. Then he found the jerky he made in late summer, tough and salty, and probably not meant for creatures that weren't human. He set strips of it on a chipped enamel plate. Half a loaf of sourdough bread, stale enough to be nearly stone. The tin of powdered milk he kept but rarely used. The younger of the two young ones crept closer to the stove, one massive hand reaching toward the heat, then pulling back quickly when it got too close. The other stayed near its mother, pressing its forehead against her side, with a gesture so tender it stopped something in Thomas's chest. He filled a bowl with hot water and set it down on the floor, between the creatures and himself. A boundary, but also an offering. He didn't know what else to do. The smaller young one reached for the bowl. Its fingers, longer than any human fingers, had any right to be trembling slightly. It pulled back when it found the heat, then reached again, more slowly this time, letting the water run through its fur. The hand pressed gently against its mother's side in a gesture that might have been comfort or might have been ritual. Thomas looked down at his own hands. The scars ran the length of his forearms, pale and hard from that night so many years ago. He'd reached into the fire to get to them. He didn't remember the pain, only the smoke, the way it had turned everything into shadows and nightmares, and the sound of his daughter's thin, panicked breathing. He'd survived. They hadn't. He stood there for a long time, just looking at the creatures huddled by his fire. The wind continued its assault on the cabin walls. Outside, the world was trying to erase everything. Inside, something impossible was breathing. Later, after the cabin had settled and the fire had burned low to a gentle glow, Thomas dozed in his chair. He hadn't meant to sleep, he'd meant to stay alert, to keep watch, but the warmth and the exhaustion and the strangeness of it all had pulled him under before he could resist. He woke to find a blanket pulled over his legs, not the scratchy army surplus. One of his own, the thick wool one Margaret had given him years ago, back when they believed there would be enough years to matter. It was warm, heavier than he expected, and it smelled like the cedar chest where he'd kept it. One of the young ones sat a few feet away, watching him, not in a way that suggested hunger, in a way that suggested something closer to curiosity. Thomas didn't move, didn't acknowledge the gift, just let his eyes open to slits and watched the watching in return. There was intelligence there, something that looked at him and saw more than just food or threat, something that made judgments, something that remembered. The fire threw long shadows across the cabin walls. The mother rested, her breathing deeper now, more regular. The other young one was curled against her side, already asleep or close to it. The world outside the cabin was muffled under snow and darkness. For the first time in a very long time, Thomas Weatherby didn't feel alone. When morning came, it came grey and thin, the kind of light that barely qualified as day. The snow had stopped, but the cold had intensified, the kind of cold that made even breathing feel like work. Ice had formed on the inside of the windows. The cabin temperature had dropped significantly, but the mother and her young had created their own microclimate bodies, pressed together, breath mixing, producing enough warmth to survive the night. Thomas rose slowly. His joints protested. The scar tissue in his forearms was tight, the way it got in extreme cold. He fed the fire first, then set about the morning routine that had become the rhythm of his life. Coffee, bread, the simple mechanics of keeping a body functioning. He was halfway through breakfast when he noticed the tracks. Outside the cabin, in the fresh snow that had blown across the porch, were handprints, not hand-shaped like human hands, broader, with fingers spread wider, and they led right to the window, where the mother had first pressed against the glass. There was snow still clinging to her fur, where she'd stood there in the brutal cold, waiting, asking. He went to the window and looked out at the yard. The forest beyond was completely white, every detail erased by the night's snow. The world looked like it had been reset, everything previous cleared away. Thomas made a decision then, though he wasn't entirely sure how or when the decision got made. He went to the cupboard and began pulling things out. The half-cured venison he'd been aging, more bread, the last of the jam Margaret had made before she died. He'd kept one jar, never opened, waiting for an occasion that never came. He found dried apples, hardtack, anything that might constitute food for creatures whose needs he didn't understand. He laid it all out on the floor near where the mother rested. She opened her eyes and watched him work, tracking his movements with an attention that made him think she was assessing him, judging his choices, weighing his intentions. When he stepped back, she didn't move right away. Then, slowly, the smaller of the young ones crept forward and began to eat, careful and deliberate. The other followed. They fed with an efficiency that suggested they understood the value of food, the way things do when they've known hunger. The mother didn't feed. She just watched, her breathing still labored, her shoulder still stained with blood that had dried to rust color. Thomas sat in his chair and waited. He didn't have anywhere else to be. For the first time in years, the mountain kept its weather on the other side of the walls, and he was warm. By noon, the mother had managed to take some water and a few strips of jerky. The effort cost her. Pain flickered across her face, and her breathing became shallow for a time after. But the young ones stayed close, and the cabin filled with a presence that Thomas hadn't known he needed. It was on the second day that the tracks appeared outside. Thomas noticed them from the window while the creatures slept. Boot prints in the snow, coming from the direction of the access road. Fresh prints, maybe a few hours old. Someone had been here. Someone had looked around. He felt something shift in his chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the cold. The tracks circled the cabin once, then moved on toward the ridge. But the message was clear. He wasn't as isolated as he'd believed, and whoever had made those tracks might be back. That night, Thomas sat by the fire and looked at the creatures sleeping in his cabin, one massive mother and two young ones, all of them curled together like they belonged there. He thought about what he was hiding, what he was protecting, what might come if anyone else knew. The wind picked up again as the sun dropped below the ridge. By nightfall, snow was falling once more, steady and determined, covering the tracks from outside, erasing evidence, making the world white again. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair and listened to the wind, listened to the breathing of the creatures by the fire, listened to the mountain doing what mountains do, keeping their secrets, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to seek them out. By the third day, the mother was moving better. The wound in her shoulder was still inflamed, but she managed to stand for brief periods, testing her weight, slowly rebuilding trust in her own body. The young ones were already exploring the cabin, their massive fingers trailing across the walls, touching everything, learning by contact. Thomas had begun to wonder if they would ever leave. The snow showed no signs of stopping. The weather reports on the old radio spoke of a system stalling out over the region, unseasonable cold coming down from Canada, wind speeds that made travel dangerous. But he knew it was more than weather keeping them there. There was a trust being built in the silence of the cabin. Not spoken. They never spoke, never made complex sounds beyond low hums and the occasional breath held and released, but present nonetheless. A kind of understanding that didn't require language. On the fourth night, after the young ones had settled near the mother, Thomas found himself thinking about Emma. His daughter would be 42 now, if she'd lived. He tried to imagine what she would have become. Would she have wanted children of her own? Would she have lived in California or come home? Would she have understood what he was doing here, or would she have been horrified? The mother opened her eyes and looked at him across the dark cabin. Just looked, just met his gaze with an attention that suggested she understood something about his grief, something about loss, something about the way time kept taking things. He didn't look away, neither did she. And in that moment, suspended between her world and his, between the known and the impossible, something shifted inside Thomas Weatherby. Some old wound that he'd been carrying alone for 34 years found itself witnessed. The next morning, Thomas woke to find a gift on the table beside his chair. He didn't know what it was at first. Just a bundle, small, carefully arranged. As he looked closer, he realized it was flowers, dried wildflowers, purple and faded, tied with sinew from some animal. arranged with a precision that suggested intention, real intention, meaning one of the young ones was watching him from across the room, waiting perhaps for a reaction. Thomas picked up the bundle slowly. His hands trembled slightly. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had given him a gift. Couldn't remember a time when the gesture meant anything beyond obligation. He held it carefully, like it might dissolve, and turned back to the young one. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words felt strange in the cabin. He hadn't spoken to another living thing in so long that his voice came out rough, rusty, like a door hinges that hadn't moved in years. The young one made a low sound, something between a hum and acknowledgement. Then it turned and went back to its mother. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cabin, something had fundamentally changed. That afternoon, Thomas heard the sound of an engine. It was distant at first, carrying on the wind from the direction of the access road. He went to the window immediately, his body moving faster than his mind could process. Through the frost-covered glass, he could see the yellow top of a vehicle moving slowly through the white landscape. A truck, official-looking. The creatures sensed his alarm immediately. They went very still, that preternatural stillness that suggests an animal reading danger. The mother's breathing changed, became shallow, focused. The young ones moved closer to her, staying low. Thomas watched as the truck came up the drive toward the cabin. It moved slowly, carefully, the driver taking his time through the snow. It pulled up about 50 yards from the cabin and stopped. A man climbed out, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an olive-drab Ranger service coat. Mid-50s, maybe weathered face, the kind of solid competence that comes from decades working land. He stood for a moment, looking at the cabin, then began walking around it, examining the perimeter, the foundation, checking the woodpile. Thomas felt his heart rate increase. The stranger was looking for something, or checking on something he'd heard about. The man stopped at the corner of the cabin where the tracks had been, the ones from days ago. He crouched down, studying the disturbed snow where it had been blown partially clear. Then he stood and turned back toward the cabin. For a moment, his eyes seemed to meet Thomas's through the window. Thomas stepped back immediately, pulling away from the glass. "Stay still," he whispered to the creatures. "Please, just stay still." A knock came on the door. Solid, official, the kind of knock that expected an answer. Thomas moved to the door but didn't open it. "Yes?" he called through the wood. "Name's Patterson," the man called back. "Forest Service. Got a report about tracks in this area. Unusual ones. Thought I'd check on the cabins." Thomas's hand was on the latch, but he didn't open it. "Everything's fine here," he said. "Mind if I come in for a moment?" Need to verify the property's still in good standing. It was a reasonable request, a routine request. The kind of thing that happens sometimes when you lived in wild places. But Thomas knew that opening this door would mean exposure. It would mean questions he couldn't answer honestly. He also knew that refusing would raise suspicion. "It's not a good time," Thomas said. "I'm just settling in after being in town. Place is a mess." A pause, long enough that Thomas could hear blood moving in his own ears. "All right," Patterson said finally. "You got any reports of unusual activity out here? Strange animals? Anything like that?" Thomas's hand was sweating on the latch. "No, nothing. Quiet as always." "All right," Patterson said again. "Well, you take care of yourself. Weather's supposed to get worse before it gets better." Thomas listened as the man's footsteps crunched back through the snow. The truck door opened, closed. The engine turned over, and the vehicle began to back away from the cabin. Thomas stood at the door for a long time after the sound of the engine had faded to nothing. Behind him, the creatures made no sound, but he could feel the tension in the air, the way they were all holding their breath, waiting for safety to be confirmed. When he turned back to look at them, the mother was standing, not fully, but risen to her front limbs, her massive head turned toward the door, listening, assessing. Thomas understood in that moment that he was no longer just protecting them. They were also protecting him from having to make choices he wasn't ready to make. Part 2, the choice. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the dying fire and watched the creatures rest. The mother was curled around her young, their breathing synchronized, their bodies touching in the way that meant safety to them. Outside, the wind had picked up again, that peculiar sound it made when it came off the high peaks, a sound like something ancient, calling to something equally ancient. He thought about Patterson, about the report the man had mentioned, about how long it would take for someone else to come looking, and whether next time they would be more insistent about checking inside. The mother opened her eyes and looked at him in the firelight. Just looked. The intelligence in that gaze was undeniable now, after 4 days of proximity. This was not an animal acting on instinct. This was a being making calculations, weighing options, understanding the danger in ways that went beyond simple survival. Thomas understood then that she knew what his choice meant. Letting them stay was a choice. Protecting them was a choice. And choices had consequences. He rose slowly and moved to the window. The snow had stopped again, but the cold had intensified. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 22 below zero. The kind of cold that killed things quickly. The kind of cold that made survival measured in hours, not days. He could still see the disturbed snow where Patterson had walked. By morning, new snow would cover it. By tomorrow night, there would be no evidence that anyone had been here. Thomas made coffee, though it was the middle of the night. The water had to be heated on the old wood stove, and the process took time, but time was something he had in abundance. While the water heated, he began to clean the cabin not frantically, but deliberately. He moved the dishes from where the creatures had eaten. He swept the floor where they'd shed fur. He arranged the blankets to look like they'd been there all along, part of his normal living rather than recent arrivals. By the time the coffee was ready, the cabin looked as close to normal as he could make it. The smaller of the young ones watched him work with what might have been curiosity. It had begun to shadow his movements, staying a few feet behind as he moved from the stove to the hearth, to the corner where he kept supplies. The young creature's massive hand reached out once to touch a book on the shelf. Thomas's library consisted of perhaps 200 volumes, mostly wilderness guides and history, the accumulated reading of a man who'd spent 3 decades thinking about how to live alone. The creature traced one long finger down the spine of a leather-bound copy of Thoreau's Walden. The gesture was gentle, exploratory, the way a child might touch something beautiful and fragile. Thomas found himself wondering what this creature saw when it looked at the world. What framework it used to understand things. Whether it had language, or if its understanding operated on some other frequency entirely. He was still wondering about this when the mother made a low hum that rose and fell like music. Both young ones responded immediately, moving to her side. She pressed her forehead to each of them in turn, a gesture that seemed to convey instruction or reassurance or both. Then she turned those dark eyes to Thomas. He understood without words that she wanted him to come closer. Thomas set down his coffee cup and walked slowly across the cabin. The young ones parted to let him approach, but they didn't move far. They stayed close, watching, ready to react if he made the wrong move. The mother's breathing was stronger now. The wound in her shoulder had begun to scab over, and while inflammation still marked the tissue around it, the infection that had seemed imminent 4 days ago had not come. She was healing. She reached out one massive hand and placed it on his forearm, not threateningly, but firmly. Her claws retracted, leaving only the pads of her fingers against his skin. She was warm. Her fur was coarse, but not unpleasant. Her eyes held his with a directness that made it impossible to look away. In that moment, Thomas felt something shift inside him. Some old architecture of belief reorganized itself. This was not a wild animal. This was a being, a mother, a protector of her young, a creature that understood loss, the way he understood loss. She released his arm and made that humming sound again. One of the young ones pressed against his leg, the smaller one, the one that had been shadowing his movements. It was a gesture of trust, of integration, of choosing to see him as part of the group. Thomas reached down slowly and placed his hand on the creature's head. The fur was softer there, almost fine, with an undercoat that was surprisingly warm. He felt the skull beneath massive, but shaped with intelligence. A being that thought, that felt. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but I won't." The young one made a low sound, almost a purr, and pressed harder against him. For the rest of that night, and into the next day, Thomas made preparations. He moved supplies around to create better separation between the living space and the sleeping area. He moved his own cot to the far corner of the cabin, establishing clear territory that was his and territory that was theirs. He reinforced the shutters on the windows so that no one looking in could easily see past the darkness inside. He also began to prepare for what he suspected was coming. If Patterson had filed a report about unusual tracks, it wouldn't take long for others to follow up. The Forest Service maintained protocols. Other rangers would be sent, possibly a wildlife specialist, possibly someone from Fish and Wildlife. The net was tightening, and Thomas had to think about what came next. The mother seemed to sense his urgency. She began to spend more time on her feet, testing her mobility, working through the pain of her injury, with a determination that suggested she was already thinking about leaving. Her young ones stayed close, watching her, learning by observation how to respond to the changing situation. On the 6th day, the snow began again, not light snow, but the kind of heavy, wet snow that came when a weather system stalled. The kind that accumulated fast and buried roads under several feet of accumulation. Thomas listened to the radio and heard the road closures being announced. Highway 2 was closed until further notice. The access road to the cabin would be impassable within hours. He realized what this meant. They were trapped, all of them. The creatures couldn't leave safely in this weather. Thomas couldn't get to town, couldn't access supplies, couldn't call for help if he needed it. They were bound together now by winter and circumstance. That evening, as the snow fell harder and the wind built into something that sounded like it had teeth, Thomas found himself sitting closer to the fire, closer to the creatures, than he'd sat before. Not from fear, but from a kind of acceptance that had crystallized over the past 6 days. The mother was sleeping, her breathing deep and regular, her body finally able to rest without pain keeping her alert. The young ones were curled against her, one using her side as a pillow, the other resting its massive head on her shoulder. They looked, in the firelight, like any family sleeping through a dangerous night. Thomas was making more coffee when he heard it. The sound of an engine, struggling against the snow, the pitch rising as it worked its way up the mountain road. A vehicle, pushing hard through conditions that should have prevented travel. Thomas moved immediately to the window. Through the swirling snow, he could see headlights cutting through the darkness. Not Patterson's truck, something larger. A 4-wheel drive vehicle with a plow attachment, pushing snow ahead of it, determined and focused. It pulled up to the cabin and stopped. The engine killed. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a figure climbed out. Tall, lean, weathered in the way of men who spent their lives in wild places. He wore a heavy coat and carried a rifle slung over one shoulder. His face was obscured by the snow and darkness, but his stance was that of someone on a hunt. Thomas felt the creatures react. The mother's eyes snapped open. Both young ones rose to their feet, moving instinctively toward the darkest corner of the cabin where shadows could conceal them. They didn't make a sound, but the air in the room changed, became charged with a different kind of tension. The man stood outside the cabin for a long time, just looking. Snow accumulated on his shoulders and hat. Wind tore at his coat, but he didn't move, didn't approach the door. He was looking for something, or someone. The knock came finally sharp, demanding, the kind of knock that expected answers. Thomas Weatherby. The voice was hard, edged with authority. "I'm Glenn Harper, Special Investigator for the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission. I need to talk to you about some incidents in this area." Thomas's mind raced. Incidents, plural. That meant there had been other encounters, other reports, other people who'd seen something they couldn't explain. He opened the door just enough to see Harper's face. Mid-60s, Thomas guessed, weathered by decades in the field. The kind of man who knew how to track things, to read sign, to pursue prey with single-minded determination. The kind of man who wouldn't easily accept explanations that didn't fit the evidence. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Thomas said carefully. Harper's eyes were sharp, intelligent, missing nothing. They tracked past Thomas into the darkened cabin, searching. "Got reports of a large animal in the area, unusual size, unusual behavior. Your property is in that search zone. You see anything unusual?" "No, nothing." "You sure about that?" "Because I've been tracking something through these mountains for 3 weeks. Big thing. Wounded. Heading this direction." Harper shifted his weight. "Your cabin's the most likely shelter in a 10-mile radius. I need to look inside." "That's private property," Thomas said. "I can get a warrant." "Then, get one." Harper's jaw tightened. He clearly wasn't used to resistance from a 73-year-old man in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Behind him, the snow continued to fall, wind tearing at the trees, the world becoming progressively more obliterated by white. "You're harboring something," Harper said finally. "I don't know what, but I know the signs. The tracks I found leading here, the disturbance around your place. Something took shelter here." Thomas didn't answer. Harper's hand shifted on the rifle. "I can wait. This weather isn't going anywhere. Roads closed for at least another day, maybe 2. I've got a truck full of supplies and nowhere else to be. You're going to have to come out eventually. Maybe you'll let me in. Maybe I'll just have to wait and see what comes out on its own." Thomas understood the threat for what it was. Harper would camp right here, would watch the cabin, would be ready if anything emerged. And eventually, winter or no winter, the creatures would have to leave. "Come in," Thomas said. Harper's eyes widened slightly with surprise, then narrowed with suspicion, but he didn't hesitate. He propped the rifle against the porch rail, a calculated gesture that said he wasn't entirely hostile, but was prepared to be, and stepped into the cabin. The wind came in with him, bringing cold and snow that immediately began to melt on the floor. Thomas closed the door carefully and turned to face the investigator. Harper was taking in the cabin with the systematic gaze of someone trained to observe. The fire, the minimal furnishings, the evidence of a life lived very simply. His eyes moved across the space and landed on the far corner where the creatures had retreated. For a moment, he went very still. The mother was standing now, her massive form unmistakable even in the shadows. One young, one crouched low beside her, the other pressed against the wall. They were silent, perfectly still, but their presence was like pressure in the room, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Harper reached slowly for the rifle he'd left outside, but he was looking at the mother, and his hand stopped midway through the motion. When he spoke, his voice was different, rougher, less certain. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "They're not going to hurt you," Thomas said. "The mother is injured. I've been helping them survive the winter." "How long?" 6 days. Harper took a step forward slowly, eyes never leaving the creatures. "That's a breach of federal wildlife law. Taking wild animals into your residence, providing shelter, interfering with..." "I'm not going to turn them out into 20 below weather to freeze to death," Thomas said quietly. Harper's jaw clenched. He was processing, calculating. His whole worldview was being recalibrated in real time. "You know what those are? You know what I've been tracking? I know what I see." "What you see is extinct," Harper said. "What you see is impossible. What you see is..." He stopped, took a breath. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier but hollow. "I've been hunting that thing for 3 weeks. Saw it once, a week ago. Just for a second, but long enough to know it was real. Big, scarred, moving wrong, like it was hurt. I set traps." Thomas felt something turn to ice in his stomach. Steel traps, set 9 of them, all around the north slope. Harper's eyes were still on the creatures. Only one was triggered. The thing that sprung it disarmed the rest. Carefully, deliberately, took the bait and broke the mechanisms without getting caught. That's not animal behavior. That's intelligence, Thomas finished. That's a mother protecting her young. Harper was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked closer to the mother. Not threateningly, but with a kind of reverence that Thomas hadn't expected. "She's wounded bad. That trap, I saw the blood trail. Thought maybe it would slow her down enough that I could." He stopped. "What was I going to do?" "What you were trained to do," Thomas said. "Eliminate a threat to the established order." Harper looked at him, really looked at him. "How is this possible? How is any of this possible? They shouldn't exist. Evolution doesn't work this way. There's no population, no sustaining genetics. No, maybe they exist despite the impossibility," Thomas said. "Maybe they've been here all along, just careful about being seen. Maybe they're smarter than we are, about surviving in a world that wants to destroy everything it doesn't understand." Harper turned back to the mother. He raised his hands slowly, palms outward. Not a surrender, but an acknowledgement, a peace offering. "I won't hurt them," he said, speaking directly to the creature as if she could understand English. "I won't report them. I won't tell anyone." The mother tilted her head, studying him. Thomas could see her assessing, calculating, trying to determine if this promise meant anything. Then, slowly, she took a step forward. Harper didn't move. He stood absolutely still as the massive creature approached him. Her breathing was controlled, focused. One enormous hand reached out and very gently touched his shoulder. Harper's breath caught. Tears appeared suddenly at the corners of his eyes, and he made no move to wipe them away. "What happened to you?" he whispered. "How did you survive?" The mother made a low humming sound, a vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. Then she stepped back and returned to her young ones, settling down to protect them, her massive body curling around their smaller forms in a gesture of maternal protection that transcended species. Harper stood there for a long time, hands still raised, tears still running down his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "My daughter died when she was 12. Car accident. She wanted so badly to see something wild and impossible before she died. We took a trip to Yellowstone. She never got to see a grizzly bear. Died 3 weeks later." He wiped his eyes roughly. "I've spent my whole life hunting things in the wilderness, predators, mostly. Things that threaten people, but I never understood until right now that maybe I was hunting the wrong things." He looked at Thomas. "You can't keep them here forever. Winter will end. The weather will clear. People will come. I know. So what happens then?" Thomas moved to the window and looked out at the snow still falling, still erasing everything, still giving them this brief window of invisibility. "I don't know yet." Harper sat by the fire without being invited. He was quiet for a long time, just staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of authority, reduced to something more like confession. "I set those traps because I wanted to prove something existed. I've been a ranger for 40 years, and every time I thought I saw something impossible, I was told I was wrong. Too tired, too far from help, too old. So when I caught the scent of something outside the normal range, when I found tracks that didn't match anything in the records, I thought this was my chance. My proof." He looked at the mother and her young. "Instead, I nearly killed a family, a mother protecting her young, a mother who understood exactly what I was trying to do and dismantled my traps instead of running from them. She left them alive," Thomas said quietly. "Even when she could have killed you by springing them. Yeah, she did." Harper's voice was rough. "I spent my whole life learning how to track, how to read sign, how to predict animal behavior, and I had no idea what intelligence actually looked like until I saw it in that one act of restraint." Outside, the wind picked up again. The storm was building, the temperature dropping further. The radio had stopped broadcasting weather updates hours ago. The world had narrowed to this cabin, this fire, this moment. "There's a man coming tomorrow," Harper said finally. Patterson filed a report. "But the weather's bad, so they delayed the follow-up. Tomorrow they'll try again. Could be 3 or 4 rangers, maybe fish and wildlife as well. They'll have dogs, they'll have equipment, they'll know how to search properly." Thomas nodded. He'd expected this. "I can go out tomorrow morning and tell them I found nothing. Harper continued. I can file an official report saying the tracks were probably a black bear, in unusual condition, that there's no evidence of an exotic species in the area. They'll believe me. They'll move on. Why would you do that? Thomas asked. Because that mother over there understood something about mercy that I didn't. Because she had the power to kill me or lead people to my location, and she chose neither. Because somewhere in this world, there's something that still believes in grace, and I'm not going to be the one to destroy that. Harper reached into his pack and pulled out a map. It was marked with his tracking route, the location of his traps, his observations. He held it over the fire and let it burn. No evidence, he said simply. By tomorrow morning, it's like I was never here. It's like none of this happened. For the rest of that night, Harper stayed in the cabin. He didn't try to approach the creatures. He didn't ask questions. He just sat by the fire and watched them sleep, and his face held an expression of something like reconciliation. In the morning, he stood at the door, ready to leave. The road will be clear by noon, he said. I'll head out, drive down to the ranger station, file my report. You'll have maybe 12 hours before they realize the false report is a false report. That's not much time. I know, Thomas said. Where will they go? Thomas looked at the mother, who was standing now, stronger each day, her wound beginning to truly heal, somewhere deeper, somewhere where the wilderness is still wild enough to hide them. Harper nodded. He seemed to understand that this was the only possible answer. The creatures couldn't stay. Humanity's circle was tightening, and the wild places were shrinking, but there were still edges. There were still places where a determined family could disappear. Tell her something for me, Harper said as he pulled on his coat. Tell her I'm sorry for the traps. Tell her I understand now what I was trying to kill, and I understand why she was trying to survive. She already knows, Thomas said. I think she's always known. Harper was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped out into the snow. Thomas watched from the window as the investigator made his way to his truck. Harper moved slowly, deliberately, not looking back. The snow had piled up significantly in the night. It took him several minutes to excavate the vehicle enough to get it started. When the engine finally turned over, Harper drove down the mountain without hesitation, without looking back. Inside the cabin, the mother made a low sound, a call, perhaps, or a greeting to the world she was about to return to. Her young ones responded immediately, standing, ready, understanding that change was coming. Thomas spent that day preparing. He gathered supplies, food, blankets, a map of the deep forest, where logging roads didn't reach and civilization still hadn't penetrated completely. He knew these mountains, knew the passes and the hidden valleys, knew places where a being could disappear into the landscape so thoroughly that no amount of searching would find them. That night, he made a meal not because the creatures needed elaborate food, but because he wanted to mark the occasion. One final meal before everything changed. As they ate together, Thomas and three beings that shouldn't exist, sharing warmth and food and the simple comfort of survived darkness, he found himself thinking about Emma, about Margaret, about all the things he'd lost in that fire so many years ago. And he realized something that he'd been too numb to understand before. Loss and discovery weren't opposites. They were part of the same spectrum. You didn't find beauty in the world unless you'd first experienced the emptiness of loss. You didn't understand the value of a life unless you'd grieved its potential departure. This family, injured, hunted, impossible, had given him something he thought he'd lost forever. Purpose. Not obligation. Purpose. A reason to be alive that went beyond simply continuing to draw breath. When the sun rose on their last day together, Thomas knew what he had to do. He opened the door to the cabin and stepped out into the snow. The forest stretched before him, white and vast, and full of shadows where anything could hide. The mountains rose beyond, ancient and indifferent to human concerns. Come on, he said quietly. The mother emerged first, moving carefully but with growing confidence. Her wound had sealed completely now, the scar tissue already forming, her strength returning. Behind her came the young ones, massive and curious, ready for the world that existed beyond the small shelter they'd known for 9 days. They didn't leave immediately. They paused at the clearing's edge, and the mother turned back to look at the cabin, at Thomas. He understood what she was asking. "Are you coming?" "I can't," he said. "I belong to the world of roads and towns and people. You belong to the places beyond that. If I came with you, I'd slow you down. I'd eventually be found, and they'd follow me to you." The mother made a low sound, not quite agreement, but understanding. "But I'll protect the secret," Thomas continued. "I'll tell them nothing. I'll let them search and find nothing. And every winter after this, if you want to come back, if you ever need shelter, this cabin will be open." The mother stepped forward and placed her massive hand on his shoulder one last time. The gesture was profound, laden with meaning that transcended words. Then she turned, gathered her young ones with a low call, and led them into the forest. Thomas watched them disappear into the trees, watched until the white snow had reclaimed all evidence of their passage, watched until the forest had folded itself around them and made them part of the wilderness once again. Then he went back inside the cabin and waited. The rangers came at noon, 4 of them, with dogs and tracking equipment and the particular confidence of men who believed that wilderness belonged to them. They searched the property thoroughly, checked the cabin carefully, found nothing unusual except an old man living alone in the mountains, which wasn't actually illegal. They'd been expecting evidence of something impossible. Instead, they found only isolation, only a solitary existence, only the ordinary markers of a person learning to live without the world. Patterson shook his head apologetically. "False alarm, I guess. Harper must have been mistaken about the tracks. Wild place like this. Easy to see what you want to see." Thomas agreed. Easy to see what you want to see. Harder still to see what was actually there. After the rangers left, Thomas stood in his cabin and looked at the place where the creatures had slept. The blankets still held the shape of their bodies. He didn't wash them. He folded them carefully and laid them in the cedar chest where Margaret's quilts had been stored for so long. He made coffee and sat by the fire. Winter stretched ahead of him, still 4 more weeks of snow and cold before spring began its slow return. He would spend those weeks maintaining the cabin, keeping the fire alive, preserving supplies. He would spend them remembering the way the mother had moved, the gentle intelligence in her eyes, the impossible trust that had been built between them. And he would spend them waiting to see if she would come back when winter came again. The radio reported that night that an exotic predator had been tracked through the region, but that the investigation had turned up no conclusive evidence. The case was being closed. The wilderness had won again, had kept its secrets, had protected those who belonged to it. Thomas listened to the report and smiled. Outside the cabin, snow began to fall again. Not the heavy, accumulating snow of deep winter, but the lighter snow of a season ending. Behind it, somewhere in the deep forest, was a mother and her young, moving through a landscape that suddenly seemed less hostile than it had before. A ranger's was changing his mind about predators. An old man had learned that grace could exist in the presence of power that chose not to use itself destructively. The stories the mountains could tell were deeper and stranger than most people imagined. Thomas pulled the blanket that one of the young ones had placed over him so many nights ago around his shoulders and sat watching the fire. The flickering light cast moving shadows on the walls, shadows that might have been memories or might have been promises. When morning came and the snow had stopped, Thomas walked to the clearing's edge and looked out at the forest. No movement, no sign, just the vast, impassive wilderness, going about its eternal business. But as he turned to go back inside, he saw something on the porch railing. A bundle of dried flowers, tied with sinew, left as a gift in the pre-dawn darkness. Fresh, recently placed. Thomas picked it up carefully. The purple wildflowers were fragile, their dried petals barely holding together. But they were there. Evidence that they'd come back, that they'd remembered, that the bond built in those 9 days had not been erased by distance or time. He held the bundle to his chest and looked out at the forest one more time. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me that grace still exists, for reminding me what I was living for. The wind moved through the trees, and in its movement, he heard the echo of a low hum, a vibration that seemed to carry memory and hope, and the promise of another winter to come. Thomas turned and walked back into the cabin. He placed the bundle of flowers on the mantel, beside the photograph of Margaret and Emma that he'd finally brought out from the cedar chest after so many years of hiding. "They're still out there," he said to the photographs, to the memory of his family, to the impossible grace that the universe sometimes permitted. "They're alive. They're surviving. They chose mercy." He made coffee and sat by the fire as the morning light grew stronger. The wind continued to move through the eaves of the cabin, that same wind that had blown down from the high peaks for thousands of years, that had existed before humans came and would exist long after they left. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear something like a voice, ancient, patient, wise, the voice of wild things learning to trust the impossible, the voice of grace surviving in a world that rarely protected it, the voice of the forest keeping its deepest secrets safe. The woods keep their secrets, always have. The question isn't whether that's true. The question is, what are you willing to believe when the evidence stands in front of you?